I've said this many times before, but when I started my journey into photography, my real first step into prime lenses was a 50mm. The reasons were simple. I've been hearing people saying that a nifty 50 is a must-have. But I had no real experience with prime lenses at the time. I was shooting with a basic zoom kit lens at the time that barely opened to f3.5. And then there was bokeh. The idea that a small affordable 50mm f1.8 could separate my subject from the background, blur the world away and make everything look more cinematic, whatever that means, was incredibly exciting. So that's exactly what I did. I went out and bought a Sony 50mm f1.8 for my Sony a7 II at the time, and the results, I was astonished. Looking back now, those early photos were nothing special, but for a younger version of me, experiencing real subject separation for the first time, it was magical. So much so that I didn't use another lens for 2 full years. The 50mm didn't feel like a choice anymore. It was like a part of the camera. After those 2 years though, I started wanting more reach, more compression, more drama. That's when I picked up the Sony 85mm and I shot with it for another year, chasing isolation, blur and compression. But eventually, I realized something important. There is more to photography than bokeh and separation. I wanted wider lenses, less reach but more context. Less drama, but more story. And that's when it clicked. The logical next step wasn't longer, it was wider. And that's when the 35mm entered the picture. So I went out and bought a budget 35mm at the time, the Samyang 35mm f2.8. It wasn't anything special, but it got the job done. As soon as the package arrived, I unboxed it, mounted off the camera and stepped outside to test it. I was living in Leicester at the time. It was already night when I got the package on my hands, but I didn't care. I was full of enthusiasm, ready to step outside and capture those wider, more immersive scenes. Until I placed my eye to the viewfinder. What I saw completely confused me. Everything was dark, undefined forms, small figures scattered all across the frame. There was no drama, no separation, no clear subject. Just mess. At the time, I couldn't understand what was going on. Looking back now, I realize that this reaction is completely normal. When you commit to a focal length for years and suddenly you switch to another one, especially one that sits on the opposite side of the spectrum, your eyes rebel. Focal length does more than change what fits inside the frame. It really shapes how you see. It sets the foundation for how you compose, how you move, and how you tell stories. Each focal length, no matter how close the numbers may seem, carries its own rules, challenges, and quirks. And if you take the time to understand and embrace those quirks, you can start using its lens deliberately to its fullest potential. That moment standing in the dark, completely confused by what I was seeing through a 35mm lens, was the beginning of me understanding that a 35mm and a 50mm are not just lenses. They are different ways of seeing. The first and most obvious difference between a 35 and a 50mm lens is distance. Each focal length requires you to stand at a different distance from your subject in order to frame it naturally. A 50mm is considered a mid-range lens, and to get a balanced, realistic view of your subject, you would typically need to sit somewhere between 2 and 5 meters away. That distance feels comfortable and familiar, but it also creates separation. To achieve similar framing with a 35mm lens, you would need to stand much closer, somewhere between 0.8 and 2.5 meters. And that change alone affects everything, not just how your subject looks, but how much of the surrounding world you are forced to include and how you interact with the scene itself. In street photography, many photographers like Joel Meyerowitz and others gravitate towards the 35mm for this exact reason. It allows them to stay close, react quickly, and work inside the flow of the street. Being closer makes it easier to respond to fleeting gestures, expressions, and interactions as they happen. With the 50mm, you naturally take a step or two back to include more context. That extra distance slows you down. It gives you a bit more time to observe, but it can make it harder to react instantly. In fast-moving street situations, that often leads to missed moments. And because of this, a 50mm lens tends to push you towards isolation and compression rather than inclusion and more complex layered compositions. But distance doesn't just change the frame, it also changes how you show up in the scene. If you enjoyed this video so far, hit the like button and consider subscribing with a bell. I think the focal length you choose to shoot with the most says a lot about you as a person. Not in an absolute way, but in how you prefer to experience the world. A 35mm lens pushes you to enter the scene, to be a part of it rather than observe it from the outside. Because of that, it's preferred by people who want to be close to the action, who are comfortable interacting with others and stepping into the center of the moment. In many cases, I've noticed that more extroverted personalities are gravitating towards this focal length. When you are physically close and share the same space as your subject, you absorb the tension, the energy, and the emotion of the scene. The energy naturally finds its way into your images. The photographs start to feel more like a first-person narration, like the viewer stands in the same place as you were when the moment unfolded. The 50mm, on the other hand, creates a different kind of relationship. It feels more like a third-person narration, but told by someone who is emotionally invested in the story. As a mid-range focal length, it requires some distance to work properly, but not so much so that you feel disconnected. You're close enough to care, yet far enough so you can choose carefully what stays in the frame. I've always thought of the 50mm as the lens for the ambiverts, for those who can move between observation and participation, depending on the situation. It suits photographers who want to tell the story clearly and deliberately without fully removing themselves from it. There's still a personal presence in the image, I think, but it's more quiet, more controlled, and maybe more intentional. Do you agree with that? Have you also made the same observation? Regardless of who we are and what kind of creative work we want to build, we have to remember that lenses are tools. And like any tool, each focal length excels at different things. After years of trial and error, I realized that the real difference between the 35 and the 50mm becomes clear when you're out in the field making decisions moment by moment. The 35mm is often associated with wider shots, and for a good reason. It allows you to include more of the environment and place your subject within a broader context. And when you move in closer, the 35mm can produce dramatic, more intimate images that aren't necessarily flattering, but they're full of emotion. With this lens, you're often choosing feeling over perfection. The 50mm, on the other hand, leans more naturally towards isolation. It's a flattering focal length with minimal distortion and a more compressed look that renders faces in a more natural and balanced way. Facial features come forward cleanly without exaggeration. That's why the 50mm is often associated with classic portraits and subject separation. It doesn't mean that it can't be used for environmental portraits or wider scenes. It absolutely can, but the result will be calmer and flatter compared to the 35mm. Depth is present, but it's more subtle. Layers are there, they can be created, but they are more suggestive rather than exaggerated. So if your intention is strong separation, clean backgrounds, and drama through bokeh, the 50mm becomes the better choice. If your intention is to emphasize space, depth, and the relationship between a subject and its surroundings, then the 35mm naturally lends itself to that kind of storytelling. But at the end, the decision isn't what the lens can or can't do. It's more about what you want the image to say. At the end of the day, neither the 35mm or the 50mm is better. They are tools, and like all tools, their value depends entirely on how intentionally they are used. A lens on its own doesn't create meaning, it only gives you a way to express it. The 35mm asks you to step closer, to accept complexity, and to work within the mess of the real world. The 50mm asks you to slow down, to be selective, and to remove everything that doesn't serve the story. One isn't more honest or true than the other, they're simply expressing the story in different ways. What matters is knowing why you're choosing one over the other. Are you trying to feel the scene, or to observe it? Are you trying to embrace the tension or to protect simplicity? When you make the choice consciously, both lenses can be very powerful. When you don't, they both can be very limiting. Over time, I learned that growth in photography doesn't come from finding the perfect focal length. It comes from understanding how different tools shape the way you see and how you respond to the world. The more aware you become of those choices, the more intentional your images feel. So when you're holding a 35mm or a 50mm, don't think of it as a limitation. Think of it as a question. What kind of story do you want to tell right now? And how do you want it to show up inside the frame? So what's the focal length that you choose most often for your creative work? And why? I would be very interested to discuss it with you down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, the hype button, subscribe with the bell, or consider becoming a member to support the work behind these films. Now, if you want to see how I mastered the 35mm focal length, click and watch this video next. That was all for today, guys. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I will see you on the streets. Bye bye.